It was early morning, around 5 o'clock, when in the small town Saint-Marie, on a quiet street, the telephone rang. The caller was an elderly woman whose voice trembled with fear and incomprehension. She said only one sentence to the dispatcher: "I have just found a body." The police immediately drove to the scene, not suspecting that this very discovery would become the beginning of the darkest story in the life of this quiet town. First, a patrol car arrived and stopped next to an old, half-dilapidated shed on the edge of town. The shed had long been a local legend. Children told each other scary stories about ghosts. Adults complained that teenagers gathered there and left trash behind. But no one had ever taken it seriously. Now this shed was surrounded by yellow tape with the inscription, "Crime Scene." The police officers silently set up the barriers while early passers-by stopped on the opposite side of the street and tried to understand what had actually happened here. One of them, a man with a thermos of coffee who was obviously in a hurry to get to his early shift, quietly asked a police officer, "Something serious?" He did not answer but gestured for him to step back. Soon after, the investigation team arrived. Forensic technicians in blue gloves, a medical examiner, a plainclothes investigator. The atmosphere at the crime scene became even more oppressive when a small bag of objects was carried out of the shed and these were carefully spread out on the hood of the police car. At first, they were simple things: dirty sneakers, a worn red cap, a crumpled chocolate wrapper from Milky Way. Ordinary little things that could be found with any boy. But here and now, neatly laid out in a row, they seemed like a silent reproach to those who had not been able to prevent what had happened. The investigator looked attentively at the shed where the experts were working, and it seemed as if even the air around him had become heavier. He pulled a notebook from his pocket and began slowly to write something down. Later, someone would notice that his hands were trembling slightly. Around 8 o'clock in the morning, when the town had already awakened and the news was beginning to spread in the neighboring streets, the police confirmed what the residents feared most. The found body belonged to Lucas van der Veen, the same Lucas who had literally left the house the evening before to go for a walk and had never returned. At that moment, the entire life of the small town stood still, because it became clear something irrevocable had happened. The very first and most important question that faced the investigators in the Lucas van der Veen case sounded so obvious that one hesitated to speak it aloud. Why would anyone want to harm an ordinary boy from a quiet town? What motive could a criminal have when everything around him seemed so normal and even boring? The investigators began to check all possible versions from the place where Lucas spent most of his time, the school. And here they immediately encountered the first difficulty. The school principal, an elderly and strict woman who was visibly affected by what had happened, told the police briefly and clearly. Lucas was an exemplary student, friendly and cheerful. We never had problems with him. Classmates said he had always been helpful, had loved football and mathematics. The teachers remembered that Lucas was a quiet, thoughtful boy with whom there were never conflicts, at most ordinary small pranks. But not a single clue, not even the weakest hint that someone wished him harm. The next step, the family. Lucas's house was only a few walking minutes from that shed and did not differ outwardly from hundreds of other houses in Saint-Marie. Small, well-maintained, with a bicycle in the yard and flower pots at the front door. Lucas's mother, Maria, seemed completely lost. She answered all questions monotonously and repeated dully, "I don't understand who could have done this. We had no enemies." In the boys' room, the investigators also found nothing suspicious. Neatly folded school books, posters of football stars on the walls, a small football trophy that Lucas was so proud of, and a game controller next to the monitor. Everything so ordinary that it was almost irritating in its normalcy. No strange messages on the mobile phone. No dubious notes in the notebooks. Nothing that could have given the police even the slightest clue. The investigation then turned to the statistics of the town itself. Saint-Marie is a place where not a single serious crime has occurred in the last 10 years. The biggest event of the year was usually the fair for the town festival, and the police dealt more often with runaway dogs than with serious investigations. Even the version that Lucas might have been approached by some stranger seemed like science fiction. It simply did not fit into the familiar life of the town where everyone knew everyone, and front doors often stood wide open. After long days of searching, countless questioning and checking, the police came to a sobering conclusion. In the preliminary investigation report, there where the cause should be clearly stated, appeared a brief and cold statement. Motive, not determined. Precisely this short sentence transformed the crime into an absolute puzzle and made the investigators realize that whoever had harmed Lucas was somewhere very nearby and might still remain undiscovered. When the investigators realized that an obvious motive was missing, they had to return to the starting point and ask the simplest and at the same time most important question. What did Lucas's last day actually look like? Who had seen him last and under what circumstances? Everything began with an ordinary morning. Tuesday, sunny weather. Lucas got up at 7 o'clock as always, quickly ate cornflakes with milk and ran to school. His neighbor, Madame Armand, remembers how he waved to her while running, and she did the same smiling. At that time, this day seemed no different from dozens of others. The teachers at school also remembered Lucas as quiet and even a little dreamy. In the last lesson, mathematics, he was apparently somewhat distracted, looked out the window and scribbled something on the edge of his notebook. The teacher even admonished him, but without ill intent. Lucas smiled embarrassedly and nodded. When the school bell rang at 14:30, Lucas left school in the company of his classmate Peter. The boys walked together to the corner of Baker Street, and there, after saying goodbye, Peter turned left while Lucas went straight ahead, toward the town park. From this moment on, the witness statements began to contradict each other. Some residents later said they had seen Lucas walking slowly, as if he was waiting for someone or simply was not in a hurry to get home. Other statements were even more unclear, but the most valuable testimonies came from the children who were playing in the park. Several names were recorded in the interrogation protocols. Jessica Morel, 10 years old, Danny Legrand, 9 years old, and Emma Delcroix, who was only 8. Each told approximately the same story, although the details differed slightly. Jessica told the police she had seen Lucas around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. He was sitting on a wooden bench next to the big slide and was thoughtfully silent. In his hands, he held a small red toy car. Lucas seemed to be turning it in his hands as if he was considering what to do with it next. Danny confirmed that Lucas was indeed in the park, but according to his words, the boy seemed irritated or even a little angry. He stood up from the bench several times, looked toward the main avenue as if he was waiting for someone, and then sat down again. At some point, Danny added, a small girl with blonde hair approached him and began saying something to him while gesticulating lively. Lucas seemed to become even angrier. When the police showed Danny a photo of Emma Delcroix, the boy recognized her confidently. That was her. The clearest statements were made by 8-year-old Emma Delcroix. The girl told the police she had gone to Lucas because she wanted him to give her the toy car, exactly the red car he was sitting with on the bench. That was my brother's toy, and Lucas wouldn't give it back. I asked for it, and he said it was his car now, the girl explained. At some point, the conversation escalated into a loud argument. Lucas even raised his voice and said, "Leave me alone, Emma. It's just a toy car." Other children also confirmed that the argument was noticeable and visibly tense. After that, according to Emma, Lucas stood up from the bench, abruptly put the car in his pocket and walked away without even looking back. This happened around 15:20. No one else among the questioned children and adults in the park saw him after that. Thus, the last recorded point on this day was a conversation that turned into a conflict. The witnesses were absolutely certain that Lucas had last spoken with Emma Delcroix. Exactly after their argument, the boy disappears forever from view. The police naturally understood that an 8-year-old girl could hardly be involved in what happened next. But exactly this brief, lively, and unexpected interaction was to become the starting point for further investigations, because someone else might have noticed what happened after Lucas left the park. The last person who had seen Lucas was little Emma Delcroix. They had argued over a simple toy car. But could this childish conflict really lead to something serious? The answer could only be one. One had to search for traces at the scene of the incident, there where the most terrible thing had happened. So what did the investigators manage to find near that abandoned shed? The day after the tragedy, the police of Saint-Marie returned again to the place where the ominous discovery had been made. The old shed stood at the edge of the town, surrounded by dense undergrowth and long, unmowed grass. Once someone's vegetable garden had been here, now there was only abandoned land and boards that barely held on rusty nails. Inside the shed, it was half dark even during the day, and the air was saturated with the smell of old wood and dampness. The forensic technicians moved carefully and examined thoroughly every board, every centimeter of the dusty floor. Lucas had been found here, at the back wall, in a corner, next to a pile of old hay and garbage. The body lay in an unnatural position. It seemed as if he had tried to hide or protect himself from something terrible. The police officers carefully marked the position, secured the shoe prints that were almost completely erased, and began to expand the search radius around the shed. Every meter of the surrounding terrain was examined with special care, aware that even the most insignificant object could be overlooked. Empty bottles, candy wrappers, old pieces of furniture. All of this was attentively inspected and packed into separate bags. But for several hours, nothing was found that could have helped the investigation. Just as the team had almost completed the inspection, one of the officers noticed something unusual in the bushes, about 10 meters from the shed. On the ground lay a small object that absolutely did not fit the overall picture of abandonment. As he came closer, the forensic technician immediately called his colleagues over with a gesture. It was a knife. Not a kitchen knife and not a folding knife. A hunting knife, with a massive wooden handle and a slightly curved blade. It lay there as if it had been dropped in haste, and no attempt had even been made to hide it. The experts carefully took it for analysis. Even with the naked eye, it could be seen that on the blade were small but distinct brown stains, and the handle was covered with dirt and something else that could be traces of human fingers. The forensic technicians began to examine the area around the knife even more carefully, but found nothing more except a multitude of mixed shoe prints that could not be identified due to the mud. It became clear that precisely this object could be the key to the entire case. The police officers immediately remembered the children's words about the last argument between Lucas and Emma. Could a children's quarrel over a toy car really end so terribly? Even experienced investigators asked themselves. But logic quickly brought them back to reality. It was unlikely that 8-year-old Emma had any connection to the found knife. To whom did it belong then? And why was it located precisely here? While the experts packed the knife into a special container for further analysis, tension rose among the officers. No one doubted that this discovery would completely change the course of the investigation and perhaps bring them closer to solving it. While the forensic technicians recorded the details, the investigator went again to the shed, as if hoping the building itself would give a hint. He inspected the area slowly once more, looked at the wall against which Lucas had been leaning, and noticed a small scratch on a board. Perhaps the boy himself had tried to say something with this movement, or it was just a coincidence. No one could say with certainty now. Everything the investigation had in hand was a knife and a multitude of questions without answers. Thus the investigation, after hours of examination, had the first serious clue. The knife, found only 10 meters from the place where Lucas was, could tell much. It had to be carefully examined, the fingerprints and traces of substance on the blade studied. But the most important thing was, now the police of Saint-Marie were finally convinced that the tragedy did not happen by chance, but was the result of targeted actions by someone. The investigation had a clear focus, and now the investigators were ready to continue to find out to whom the found knife belonged and why it was located next to the body of Lucas van der Veen. The knife found near the shed became the first real clue. On its blade, suspicious traces on the handle, clear fingerprints. Now only one thing remained for the investigators, to find out to whom these prints belonged. But could anyone have imagined where this check would lead? The experts immediately sent the found knife to the laboratory for dactyloscopic examination. This was a standard procedure that took several days, and while the forensic technicians waited for the results, the investigators did not sit idle. They decided to speak once more with the Delcroix family. After all, Emma was the last one who had seen Lucas that day, and she had argued with him. The Delcroix family house was located only a few streets from the park, an ordinary two-story house with a well-maintained yard, flower beds at the entrance, and a small children's playground in the garden. Emma's parents, Pierre and Camille, received the investigators with concern, but hospitably. They still did not understand why the police needed to speak with them again. The investigator began carefully and unhurriedly to ask questions about the recent days, the daughter's mood, and finally about possible oddities in Emma's behavior or unusual events at home. The parents looked at each other, and the investigator immediately understood that they remembered something. Pierre Delcroix suddenly said that a few days ago he had noticed the disappearance of one of his hunting knives. It was his old knife that he kept in a box on the top shelf of the closet, where Emma, it seemed, could not possibly reach by herself. "I did not think at first that it was important," he admitted confusedly. "I thought I had simply put it somewhere else myself, although I now understand that this is unlikely." The investigator asked the parents to describe the missing knife more precisely. Pierre gave a description without hesitation. Wooden handle, slightly curved blade, quite massive. With each word, his voice became quieter, and the investigator understood that the description exactly matched the found piece of evidence. Emma's parents looked frightened and confused. Their daughter was an ordinary 8-year-old girl. She watched cartoons, played with dolls, loved animals, and was very upset when someone argued at school. "She is just a little girl, isn't she?" asked Camille Delcroix, as if she wanted to convince herself that all this was just a misunderstanding. Meanwhile, the laboratory finished its work. The specialists compared the found fingerprints with the database. At first, the check yielded no results, no match with persons who were already in the police's sights. This was even more confusing. But then one of the experts had an obvious idea: to compare the fingerprints on the knife with the samples that had recently been collected from everyone who had contact with Lucas, including the witness children. The check took additional hours. During all this time, the investigators were in tense expectation. Everyone hoped that the result would point to an adult, to someone who could pose a threat, because an alternative was unimaginable. But a call from the laboratory destroyed the last hopes for a convenient version. "We have a match," the voice of the forensic technician on the phone reported, hesitated briefly and added, "But you will not like this." When the investigator held the results in his hands, he had to read them several times before he could trust his own eyes. The fingerprints on the handle of the knife with which the crime was committed matched exactly with the fingerprints of 8-year-old Emma Delcroix. At first, no one wanted to believe it. But the document lay before their eyes, black on white. Name, age, date of verification, everything matched. Now the investigators had to decide how to proceed further. On the evening of the same day, a police car drove up in front of the Delcroix family house. Emma's parents, who saw the police officers through the window, immediately understood that the news was bad. Pierre opened the door. Behind him stood Camille, holding her daughter pressed tightly to herself, who did not understand why everyone around her was so tense. The investigator spoke quietly, but firmly. "We have the results of the examination," We need to ask Emma a few questions alone. When the little girl got into the police car, neighbors had already come out onto the street and were puzzling over what was happening. Sainte-Marie had never experienced such a situation before. It seemed absolutely wrong and shocked everyone who witnessed it. Thus, on the 11th of April 2023, 8-year-old Emma Delcroix was officially arrested by the police of the city of Sainte-Marie. This news in itself seemed absurd and incredible, but the investigation had no other choice. The trail was clear. No one yet understood how this was possible and what would happen now. Because the investigation had now taken a completely unexpected path, and the question that tormented everyone in the city sounded the same. Could a little girl really have committed what she was now accused of? Or was this just a small part of a much more complicated story? The arrest of 8-year-old Emma Delcroix was a real shock for all of Sainte-Marie. No one could believe that such a small girl was capable of such a thing. But the fingerprints on the knife spoke for themselves. Only one question remained. Were there other pieces of evidence for her involvement in what had happened to Lucas? The investigators could not rely only on a knife. There had to be more traces, and first of all, the clothing that Emma had worn on the day of the tragedy came under suspicion. The parents silently handed over the girl's jacket and jeans to the investigators, barely concealing their fear of what the examination might find on them. The experts immediately began work. They carefully examined every detail of the clothing, searching for stains, fibers, and traces that could shed light on the circumstances. The process dragged on, and with every hour, the tension among the investigators grew. In the meantime, the police decided to speak with Emma's teachers. Perhaps they could reveal details about the girl's character. And here it turned out that Emma was far from as calm as one was accustomed to seeing her at home. The teachers told that the girl was quickly offended and could suddenly flare up even over small things. One of the educators confessed, "Of course, we are not saying that she is capable of something serious. But yes, Emma could suddenly become angry, and sometimes it was even difficult to calm her down." These statements gave no clear answer, but noticeably strengthened the investigators' suspicions. The experts meanwhile worked around the clock, checking every stain, every smallest detail. On the second day, they discovered a small brown stain on the left sleeve of Emma's jacket. Was this just dirt? Traces of chocolate? Or exactly what everyone feared? When the call came from the laboratory, the investigators were already prepared for the worst. The experts left no room for doubt. The laboratory confirmed that the brown stain found on Emma's clothing was blood, and it belonged without any doubt to Lucas van der Veen. Now the investigators had to answer the main question. What exactly had happened between Emma and Lucas on that day? And could this horror really be the deed of an 8-year-old girl? Or was there a completely different story hidden behind these traces? All traces pointed to Emma Delcroix. Fingerprints on the knife, blood on the clothing. The picture seemed clearer than ever. Only one question remained on whose answer very much depended. What did Emma herself say about what had happened on that day? Emma's interrogation took place in the presence of a psychologist and her parents. The girl appeared frightened and confused and did not quite understand why they kept asking her about Lucas. When the investigator carefully asked what had happened after their quarrel in the park, Emma lowered her gaze and said quietly, "I wanted to help." The girl repeated this sentence several times in a row, as if she wanted to convince those around her of something that only she alone knew. When she was asked to explain what she meant by "wanted to help," Emma shrugged in confusion and added, "He was lying there. I didn't know what to do." Complete silence reigned in the room. The psychologist gently asked Emma to tell in more detail what she had seen. The girl sighed, was silent for a few seconds, and then tried to explain. "When I went there, Lucas was already lying on the ground. I touched his hand. He didn't move. I got scared and ran away to get help. The investigator and psychologist looked at each other. Emma's parents also seemed confused. Her words sounded sincere, but did not fit at all with the evidence that the police had. Where then did the blood on her jacket come from? And why were her fingerprints on the knife? The investigator carefully asked the next question so as not to frighten the girl. And did you see who could have done this to Lucas? Emma shook her head and said almost in a whisper, "No, there was no one there. Only Lucas was lying there and the knife was lying on the ground." When it was explained to her that Lucas's blood had been found on her clothing, the girl was visibly even more frightened. She began to rub her eyes with her hands and repeated over and over, "I really don't remember. I don't know why." The psychologist suggested a break so that Emma could calm down, and then the girl began again to talk about how she had really run for help, that she had been very worried about Lucas and would never have done anything bad to him. But her confused and contradictory statements only complicated the situation. The investigators could not understand how the girl's words could match the traces that clearly pointed to her as a suspect. It was noted in the protocols that Emma could not clearly explain the appearance of blood on her clothing. Moreover, in her statements there was a contradiction that greatly troubled the investigators. If she had attacked Lucas herself, why did she then so desperately claim that she had tried to help him? At this point, the investigators had the impression that the girl was possibly hiding something, was afraid to tell the truth, or was so frightened by what she had seen that her memories were confused and inaccurate. However, the contradictions became too obvious to simply ignore. It was precisely this crucial contradiction that caused the investigation to doubt for the first time the version that had seemed obvious until then. If Emma had really attacked Lucas, why did she speak so persistently about having run away to get help? Something in her story did not add up. For the first time, the police allowed the possibility that behind this tragic incident was hidden a completely different, far more complicated story. And now it had to be found out which one exactly. Emma's story raised more and more questions. On one hand, there was Lucas's blood on the girl's clothing, and her fingerprints were found on the knife. On the other hand, she herself said she had only been frightened and run off to get help. Someone was obviously not telling the truth. But how could one verify the words of an 8-year-old girl? The investigators decided to check every word of Emma's. If she had really run for help, someone must have seen this. New questioning of witnesses began, and this time the investigators paid more attention to the children who were in the park or nearby at that time. It was precisely in these statements that the first crack in the investigation's version showed itself. 2 school children, Sophie and Julian, both 9 years old, confirmed that they had seen Emma. According to their words, she was indeed running from the park at approximately the same time when the incident with Lucas happened. Sophie remembered. She was running very fast and shouting something. But we didn't understand what exactly. Julian added that Emma looked frightened and was even crying. These statements were extremely important, as they clearly did not fit the picture of an attacker who coldly leaves the crime scene. The investigation decided to go further and check the recordings from the city's surveillance cameras. The city of Saint-Marie was small, but some cameras were installed at important points. Particularly important proved to be a camera that was mounted on the corner of the local post office building, only a few hundred meters from the park. The experts examined the recordings carefully. The image was not particularly sharp, but clear enough to recognize the figures of people and their direction of movement. The investigators watched the recording attentively and soon saw something that gave them a feeling of great relief. On the recording, a small girl in a light jacket was clearly visible, running along the sidewalk. Her movements were chaotic. It seemed as if she was not simply running, but fleeing from something, constantly looking around. The time on the recording matched the witness statements. This meant that Emma's words, that she had run away to seek help, could be true. But the real shock came when the camera recorded something else Shortly thereafter, literally 3 minutes after Emma had disappeared from the image, another figure appeared on the same recording. A tall person in a hooded sweatshirt, obviously an adult, or at least an older teenager. He walked quickly but confidently, as if he was trying to leave the park area quickly, and even looked in the direction of the camera for a moment. The recording was too blurry to immediately determine the identity of this person, but his appearance alone at this time and place turned the entire case upside down. Until this moment, the investigation had followed a single line, and suddenly, a completely new figure appeared that could completely change the course of the investigation. The investigators understood that they urgently needed to find out who this person was and what role he played in the story with Lucas. Now, all circumstances were unclear again, but there was a new, important starting point. The surveillance camera recording completely confirmed Emma's words. She had indeed run for help and was genuinely frightened at that moment. But who was the man who appeared in the image only a few minutes after her? It was precisely his figure that made the investigators realize that they had perhaps been looking in the wrong direction so far. The investigation took an unexpected new turn, and now the investigation had to find out who was hiding under the hood and how exactly he was connected to the fate of Lucas van der Veen. After the appearance of an unknown person with a hood on the cameras, the investigation took a completely new turn. The version with Emma's involvement no longer seemed obvious, and the police decided to recheck every trace. The main question was, what would a renewed, more detailed investigation reveal? First, the investigators turned to the experts again with the request to conduct a thorough analysis of the blood stains on Emma's clothing. They had to find out how these stains could have gotten onto her jacket. Because now, after the appearance of the second figure on the recording, the version of direct involvement of the girl in the crime seemed extremely doubtful. The experts set to work with the greatest care. They examined every detail of the clothing and used special methods to determine how the blood had gotten onto the fabric. Each new step of their investigation became increasingly important because it could completely change the course of the case. And after just 2 days, the experts presented preliminary results that immediately caused great excitement among the investigators. The forensic medical examiner described in detail the nature of the stains on Emma's jacket. These were not splatters that arise from abrupt movements or blows. They were contact smears. Such normally arise when a person tries to provide help or accidentally comes into contact with an already existing wound. These conclusions confirmed Emma's words that she had tried to help Lucas and touched him to understand what had happened to him. But the investigators had to be definitively certain of this. They asked the experts to also examine in detail the nature of the injuries on Lucas's body. The forensic medical examiner checked again and carefully all injuries and immediately noticed something important. The nature of the wounds required considerable physical strength that was disproportionate to the capabilities of an 8-year-old girl. The force with which the blows were executed pointed to an adult, or at least an older teenager. At this moment, the last doubts disappeared among the investigators. The experts explained that Emma could neither physically nor due to other characteristics have inflicted such injuries. Everything fit with the fact that the girl had indeed simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time and might have tried to help. The traces on the knife, her fingerprints, the blood. All of this could be explained by the simple desire to help, which now became clear even to the strictest critics. The 15th of April 2023 became the definitive turning point. The forensic medical examination officially confirmed the impossibility of Emma's involvement in the attack on Lucas. This conclusion completely contradicted the original version and opened a completely new direction for the investigation. The examination of the 15th of April definitively cleared Emma Delcroix of any suspicion. Now the police understood that they had been following a false trail the entire time. The real perpetrator was still at large, and possibly it was that unknown person who was recorded by the surveillance camera. The whole story, which began with a simple children's dispute, had transformed into a far more complicated and terrible mystery. Now the investigation had to find out who was hiding behind the figure in the hooded sweatshirt and why he had not come into their sights until now. Now that the investigation had definitively ruled out Emma's guilt, the police faced a new, even more disturbing question. Who was the second person on the surveillance camera recording? Who could have left the park only a few minutes after Emma had run for help? The investigators knew that precisely this person could be the key to solving the entire tragedy. They sent the camera recording for renewed analysis to improve the image quality as much as possible. The technical specialists worked meticulously on the images for several days to obtain any additional details, and finally, the image became clearer. When the improved version of the recording reached the criminal experts, they immediately noticed the gait and silhouette of the unknown person. The figure on the video was quite tall, clearly an older teenager or a young man, dressed in a wide jacket with a hood. He walked quickly and confidently as if he knew where he was going. The criminalists particularly emphasized his movements, a quick, slightly bent gait with a characteristic swaying of the shoulders. Precisely this peculiarity became the starting point for the further investigation. The police began to carefully compare the obtained data with information about the residents of the neighborhood. The search radius narrowed to the nearest houses around the park, since the person on the recording was moving from the shed toward a residential district. And an important detail was the direction of movement. He was walking directly toward the Van der Veen family's house, which was no more than 700 meters away. The detectives looked at the list of residents of this district over and over again. Their attention fell on Lucas's older brother, Marcel van der Veen. At first, no one wanted to believe that this was possible. The brother, a relative. Could he really be connected to what had happened to Lucas? But the further the police checked this version, the more questions arose. The investigators began to question neighbors and acquaintances of the Van der Veen family. Someone mentioned that Marcel had become withdrawn lately, hardly went out on the street anymore, and seemed tense. Others remembered that there were disputes between the brothers, but no one could say exactly how serious these were. The police decided to invite Marcel for a conversation, but not as a suspect, but only to clarify details. At the last moment, however, the investigators changed their minds and decided to first conduct covert surveillance to see how he would behave. During this entire time, the technical specialists tried to definitively identify the person on the video. One day after the beginning of the surveillance, the police received a call from the criminalists, and this time the expert's voice sounded absolutely confident. "We have checked everything. The gait, the height, the figure, the clothing. With a probability of almost 100%, that is Marcel van der Veen." A heavy silence reigned in the investigators' room. This news seemed absurd, but the facts left no room for doubt. The police had to accept the inevitable. The 16-year-old brother of Lucas was now officially the main suspect in the case. A new suspect was thus identified, and this name shocked everyone. Marcel van der Veen, the older brother of the deceased Lucas. This news completely turned upside down the ideas about what had happened. But the investigation still had to find out whether Marcel was really capable of such a thing and what secrets he hid behind his withdrawal. Now the police were ready to dive even deeper into the investigation to understand why his own brother stood at the epicenter of the tragedy. When the investigators named the new suspect, everything in the city seemed to stand still. Nobody could believe that the older brother could be involved in the tragedy with Lucas. But the most important question was not this one now. If Marcel was indeed guilty, what motive could have driven him to such an act? To understand this, the investigators decided to collect all available data about Marcel's life. The first step was a visit to the school. There they asked for the personnel file and the records of the psychologist who regularly spoke with the teenager. With each page, the picture became more disturbing. From the school psychologist's records, it became clear that Marcel was not a simple teenager. He had spoken several times about his complicated relationships in the family, especially with his mother. The psychologist noted some of his sentences that stood out. "Mama doesn't understand me." For her, Lucas is always better. always more important, and an even harsher one. I'm tired of everything always falling to him. He's small, everything is allowed to him, and I'm simply nobody. The investigators decided to question family, friends, and neighbors to learn more about the actual relationships in the Van der Veen house. And it turned out that many knew about the tension between Marcel and his mother. One of the neighbors, Madame Leroux, said directly, "You know, in their family it was always visible that Lucas was the favorite. Marcel kept in the background, communicated almost not at all. Sometimes I heard him arguing with his mother, and he always repeated the same thing, about injustice." A family friend, Claude Gauthier, confirmed that Marcel had changed greatly recently. He became withdrawn, sullen. Sometimes it seemed to me that he was deliberately avoiding all of us. Once, when we were talking, he broke down and said that Lucas always gets all the attention, and that annoys him. But who would have thought it was so serious? With each new witness statement, it became increasingly clear. The relationships within the Van der Veen family were far from as simple as they seemed at first glance. Marcel's jealousy of his younger brother became visible even to those who were not close to the family. The deeper the investigators delved into the teenager's past, the more certain they became that they were on the right track. Finally, the police invited Marcel's class teacher, Madame Guillain, for a conversation. She knew the family well and had observed the teenager for several years. Her words sounded like the final confirmation of what the investigators already suspected. The teacher explained calmly and clearly, the mother always favored Lucas. Everyone saw that. Marcel took it hard. He often said that he felt superfluous in his own family. At this moment, the motive the investigators had been looking for became completely obvious. Now the police had no doubt that family jealousy could have driven Marcel to such a terrible act. But despite the obviousness of the motive, the investigation still had to prove that Marcel had actually committed the crime. And that was far from as simple as it seemed. The motive was thus determined and proved to be painfully simple and at the same time terrible. The older brother's jealousy of the younger one. A family tragedy that was hidden behind the quiet walls of the Van der Veen house unexpectedly broke outward and turned upside down the lives of everyone who knew them. The next step of the investigation, to find out whether a motive alone is sufficient to accuse Marcel of what happened. For now, the police faced the task of not only believing in the motive, but finding evidence that would definitively confirm or refute his involvement. Now the investigation had everything. A suspect, Marcel van der Veen, an obvious motive, jealousy of the younger brother, and indirect evidence, the video from the surveillance cameras. Only the last thing remained, to hear what Marcel himself would say. Could his words change anything, or would they only confirm the police's suspicions? On the 20th of April 2023, the police officially arrested Marcel and brought him for interrogation. The atmosphere in the interrogation room was tense. The teenager sat opposite the investigator without raising his gaze. To the first question, "Where were you on the day of Lucas's death?" Marcel answered briefly and firmly, "I was at home." But the investigator immediately understood that this was a prepared version. He did not hurry, gave the teenager time to calm down, and then turned on the surveillance camera recording. On the screen appeared the clear figure of Marcel walking with quick steps in the direction of his house. Silence reigned in the room. The teenager changed his face and said uncertainly, "That's not me." The investigator calmly and methodically pointed to the gait, the clothing, the height, emphasizing every detail. "Marcel, you understand that it's you." The camera doesn't lie. The teenager nervously clenched his hands and after a long pause said, "Okay, I left the house. But I was only in the park. I didn't go to the shed. I didn't see Lucas." With each of his words, the investigators understood that he was getting more and more entangled. They carefully asked new questions, and the teenager became increasingly irritated and less convincing. Soon, his words clearly contradicted what the investigation had already established. The investigator said slowly and clearly, "You claim you didn't go to the shed, but the camera recorded you only 200 meters from the scene of the tragedy, few minutes after Emma ran for help. How can you explain that?" Marcel hesitated again. His gaze wandered around the room. I was just taking a walk," he answered uncertainly. The investigators increased the pressure and consistently pointed to every contradiction in his words. "You say you were at home. Then you claim you were taking a walk. Then you deny seeing Lucas, although you were practically next to the crime scene. All this looks extremely suspicious, Marcel." The teenager became increasingly nervous. His voice trembled. He repeated sentences about being set up, that he couldn't harm his brother. But now his words no longer sounded convincing at all. The investigator slowly placed a printout of the school records on the table in front of the teenager. Quotes from conversations with the psychologist that spoke of jealousy and grievances. "You told the psychologist that you felt superfluous in the family. That Lucas was always the favorite. Isn't that so?" Marcel turned away abruptly to avoid looking at the documents. The investigator continued. "Teachers and neighbors have confirmed that you had reasons to be jealous of your brother. You spoke of injustice, of everything falling to him and nothing to you. Perhaps that was exactly the reason for your act." Marcel suddenly raised his head and shouted, "I didn't do that." "I couldn't." But there was no longer certainty in his voice, only desperation and anger. "Then explain why you were near the crime scene. Why did you lie about your whereabouts?" the investigator asked in a calm tone. The teenager opened his mouth as if he wanted to say something but fell silent. He slowly lowered his head and stared at the table in front of him. His shoulders sank, and it became clear that he had nothing more to reply. An oppressive silence reigned in the room. Then the investigator asked quietly, "Are you ready to tell the truth?" But Marcel no longer answered. He pressed his lips firmly together and slowly shook his head. "I will say nothing more," he said quietly. The interrogation ended in a dead end. Marcel van der Veen fell silent and refused further statements. His stubborn silence only strengthened the police's suspicions and gave the case a new dramatic turn. Now the investigators had to find irrefutable evidence to uncover Marcel's true role in the tragedy. For the teenager's silence could only mean one thing. The truth was even more complicated and terrible than it initially seemed. Marcel refused to speak. His silence was simultaneously a challenge and a dead end for the police. The teenager remained stubbornly silent, but the question remained unchanged. How could Marcel be directly connected to the murder weapon, to that knife that belonged to the Delcroix family? The investigators decided to return again to Emma's father, Pierre Delcroix. Perhaps he could remember some detail that could clarify how Marcel could have gained access to the knife from his garage. When the police asked him about this again, Pierre thought and visibly tried to remember something important. "Wait," he said suddenly with a surprised face. "I remember now. A few days before the knife disappeared, I saw someone at our garage. It was a teenager. I didn't pay attention at first. Thought maybe one of the neighbor boys. But now, yes, that was Marcel. I definitely saw him at our house, at the garage door." This memory changed the situation instantly. Now the police had a serious reason to assume that Marcel could have broken into the Delcroix family's garage and taken the knife from there that became the murder weapon. The investigators obtained a search warrant for the Van der Veen family house, particularly for Marcel's room. They acted quickly and carefully, examining every detail in the teenager's room. At first glance, nothing suspicious. The usual teenage chaos, posters on the walls, clothes on the floor. But the investigators knew they had to search deeper. In one of the desk drawers, they found several small objects that clearly did not belong to Marcel. They were seemingly insignificant things at first glance. A small soldier figure, a lighter, some coins, and what was particularly important, an unusual metallic keychain in the shape of a vintage car. All these objects seemed foreign, as if they had been taken from different people. The investigators decided to check these objects with the neighbors, and soon it became clear the keychain belonged to the Delcroix family and was normally kept exactly in the garage from which the knife had disappeared. Pierre recognized the keychain immediately. "That's mine. Definitely mine. I didn't even notice it was gone." This discovery was decisive. Now the investigation understood that Marcel had repeatedly broken into strangers' houses and garages and taken various small items. This meant it was easy for him to take the knife from the Delcroix. All pieces of the puzzle came together into a clear picture. The investigators realized that the teenager was obviously hiding much more than just jealousy toward his brother. The search revealed his secret actions and confirmed that he had direct access to the place where the murder weapon was kept. Now Marcel found himself in a much more serious situation, and the police were confident that this evidence was sufficient to shed light on the true circumstances of the tragedy. The discovery of the Delcroix family's keychain and other stolen objects became irrefutable proof that Marcel had access to the knife. This trail broke through his defense line and showed for the first time that behind the teenager's silence lay real actions that he had carefully tried to hide. Now the police only had to understand one thing: what exactly happened between the two brothers that day and why everything ended so tragically. Now the police knew exactly. Marcel had access to the knife, and there was no way back for him. Only one question remained. Would he have the strength to admit the truth, or would the teenager deny the obvious until the very end? The investigators summoned Marcel for questioning again. This time, the conversation took place in the presence of a lawyer and a psychologist. The atmosphere was even more tense. When the teenager was presented with the keychain and other objects found in his room, Marcel visibly paled and turned his gaze away. He already understood that the police had uncovered his little secret, and there was no longer any point in continuing to remain silent. But the real blow for him was the news that Emma Delcroix had been completely cleared. When the investigator said that the girl was no longer suspected and that now all facts pointed only to him, Marcel became visibly nervous. His hands trembled, and his gaze became lost. He slowly raised his head and said quietly, "I didn't want it to happen like this." The investigator asked carefully, almost compassionately, "Marcel, what exactly happened that day?" The teenager remained silent for a long time, breathing heavily, as if every word cost him enormous effort. But then, after composing himself, he began to speak. "We had an argument. It was about some nonsense, as always. Lucas started bragging again that Mom had bought him something new and not me. That just drove me to white heat. I didn't plan anything like that." Marcel fell silent and swallowed with difficulty. Then he continued, "I just took the knife like that, wanted to scare him so he would stop talking about how lucky he was. But then, he started screaming. We began to fight. I didn't want to hurt him. But suddenly everything went too fast. The room fell into complete silence. The investigators listened to the teenager's confession with heavy hearts. Marcel told that when he realized what he had done, he immediately became frightened and ran away, throwing the knife away nearby. Exactly at this moment, the camera had captured him. He couldn't even imagine that someone else could have seen Lucas and tried to help him, just as little Emma had done. Marcel van der Veen's confession sounded clear and unambiguous. Now the investigation understood all circumstances of the tragedy. A small family quarrel, childish jealousy, and a fatal chain of decisions that changed the fate of several people. But even after this confession, the story was far from over. The police had to clarify to what extent this was a conscious act, and most importantly, understand how those who remained alive after what happened should continue to live. Marcel had confessed everything, Now the investigation had only one thing left: to reconstruct the exact sequence of events of that tragic day. Because questions still remained about how exactly this story had developed from beginning to end. Everything began a few days before the tragedy when Marcel broke into the Delcroix family's garage and stole the knife. He had not planned the crime, at least he claimed so during questioning. He took the knife just like that, out of curiosity or the desire to possess something forbidden, secret. On the day of the incident, Marcel noticed his younger brother Lucas, who went to the abandoned shed at the edge of the park after school. Lucas walked slowly and thoughtfully turned that red toy car in his hands that had become the reason for his conflict with Emma. Marcel followed him, initially just to talk, but the conversation escalated almost immediately into another conflict. The teenager approached his brother and immediately threw at him everything that had built up over a long time. How tired he was of the constant attention for Lucas. How much it annoyed him that his brother was always forgiven and allowed everything. Lucas answered sharply, and the conversation quickly got out of control. Words became screams. Screams became a fight. Exactly at this moment, Marcel pulled out the knife. He said he only wanted to scare Lucas, make him understand how painful it is to always be worse, always second. But events went completely differently than he had imagined. Lucas began to defend himself, tried to break free, and then, seized by anger and despair, Marcel stabbed. When the teenager realized what he had done, it was already too late. Lucas fell to the ground and did not move. Marcel, seized by panic, immediately threw the knife into the nearby bushes and ran away. Exactly at this moment, the camera recorded his figure as he hurried toward his house. Meanwhile, just a few minutes later, little Emma Delcroix, suspecting nothing, came to the shed to retrieve her toy car. She saw Lucas lying on the ground and did not immediately understand what had happened. The girl approached, tried to help him, causing blood to get on her clothes. Frightened, Emma ran to look for adults and get help. Thus, this whole terrible story, which began with simple jealousy and small grievances, transformed into a real tragedy for an entire city. Thanks to Marcel's confession and witness statements, the police were able to reconstruct the chronology of events with absolute accuracy. No questions remained about exactly how the crime happened and who was responsible for what occurred. The complete picture of the crime was restored and fully confirmed by the files. All details of the tragedy came together, from the theft of the knife to the last moment when Emma discovered Lucas's body. The investigation finally closed all questions about the sequence of events of that fateful day. Only one thing remained: to understand how the city and the family can continue living after such a thing. The crime was solved. The details were known to all, but now the main question was different. What punishment would be imposed for such a terrible act? Would the judges consider the age and circumstances, or would the severity of what happened prevail? The trial began on the 12th of October 2023 and took place under great attention from the residents of Saint-Marie. The hall was overcrowded. Neighbors, classmates, teachers, simply compassionate people. Everyone wanted to hear the court's decision. The prosecution immediately brought forward the main charge: premeditated murder. The prosecutor was categorical. This crime was no accident. The defendant was aware of his actions and their consequences. We have a video recording, his confession, traces from the crime scene. Everything speaks for his full accountability. But the defense had a different position. Marcel's lawyer insisted that the teenager had been in a state of deep affect. He emphasized the difficult family situation, cited the statements of the school psychologist about a prolonged emotional crisis, and said the teenager had not recognized the full severity of the consequences. The main argument of the defense was Marcel's age and his emotional immaturity, which, in the lawyer's opinion, should have served as a mitigating circumstance. When the judge gave Marcel himself the floor, the teenager stood up, looked into the hall, but could say nothing. He only whispered quietly, "I'm sorry," and sat down again. His mother cried and covered her face with her hands, and it was obvious that all of this was no less a tragedy for her than for the others. The judges withdrew for deliberation, which lasted several hours. The atmosphere of waiting was tense to the extreme. The city residents argued about what was more important, punishment or a chance for improvement, the strictness of the law or mercy toward a teenager whose life is also destroyed forever. Finally, the court returned and complete silence reigned in the hall. The judge read the verdict. The court, after examining all circumstances of the case, concludes that Marcel van der Veen is guilty of premeditated murder. Taking into account the minor age and the mental state of the defendant at the time of the act, the court sentences him to 10 years imprisonment to be served in a closed educational institution for minors. The verdict was announced clearly and coldly. A sigh was heard in the hall. For some it was too mild a decision, for others a fair chance for improvement. But everyone understood one thing. The city of Saint-Marie would never be the same again, and this story would remain forever in the memory of those who had lived through it. The verdict was pronounced. Justice had prevailed. But what happened to those who remained after this tragedy? And what questions remained forever unanswered? All charges against Emma Delcroix were dropped, but the girl needed a long time to recover. The Van der Veen family fell apart. The mother left the city as she could not bear the severity of what had happened. The residents of Saint-Marie lived for a long time with the feeling of a non-healing wound and remembered the events of that day. Several months later, the case was officially archived. A blood-covered man stands in the middle of a children's room. Before him, two bodies, the walls cut as if with a knife. Children's paint everywhere, mixed with what one does not want to think about. And he looks into the mother of the girl's eyes and speaks words that do not fit this picture at all. I wanted to help. I heard screams. What is this? A terrible coincidence, a desperate attempt at justification, or something even more terrible. Please come quickly. There is blood here. My girls. My girls. Leas McCready's voice trembled and broke as the emergency call center took the call. It was 1940, 23rd of May, 2018. An ordinary Wednesday evening in the quiet settlement Perry Sound, where seemingly nothing bad could happen. Police cars drove into the orderly driveway in front of the small single-story house at 52 Lakeview Drive. The house of Leah McCready, a single mother of two girls, Emma and Grace. The police officers go inside, hurry quickly to the children's room, and their breath catches at the sight. On the floor, two small figures. Two girls who had recently played, laughed, lived. Now silence. All around, complete chaos. The walls cut by a sharp object, paint smeared so that the drawings become formless spots. In the air, the heavy smell of paint and iron. And right here, next to the doorway, stands motionless a man. A tall man with short hair and worn work jeans, covered in blood. His name is Douglas Reed, or simply Doug. He lives next door, works in an auto repair shop and supplements his income with house repairs. Doug seems lost, as if he still does not understand where he is and what is happening. His gaze fixes on each new face, trying to find some support, some indication that he is believed. I heard screams and ran over. I just wanted to help, he repeats over and over like an incantation. The first police officer who entered the children's room said later, "When you see something like this, the world around you slows down." I saw the blood on his hands, on his clothes, saw the children, and in my head was only one thought. It's him. It could not have been anyone else. The officers put handcuffs on Doug and read him his rights, although he seemingly hears nothing. He seems broken and looks so guilty that no one has even the slightest doubt. The murderer stands before them, but something in his eyes speaks of something else. Something is not right in this terrible picture. On this day, everything began quite differently. Leah McCready left the house at exactly 18:12 for the evening shift at the local store, as the neighbor's house camera recorded. Emma and Grace, her daughters, remained alone at home only very briefly. Only 1 hour until the arrival of the regular babysitter, 17-year-old Amelia Carson. Amelia was a quiet and responsible girl whom the entire street trusted. It seemed there was no reason for concern. But at 19:31, as the recordings from the neighbor's smart doorbell later showed, a piercing child's scream rang out. It was so loud and shrill that several neighbors stepped onto the porch, and one of these neighbors was Doug. Earlier, he had helped Leah several times with small repairs, tightening a faucet, fixing a door handle. No one had ever heard anything bad about him. He was not strange, not withdrawn, always greeted and smiled. But on this evening, he heard screams that changed his life forever. Doug rushed without hesitation to the McCready house, noticed that the back door was ajar. He entered, went through the kitchen and headed to the children's room from which noise and crying came. As he approached, a soft sound rang out from behind like a rustling. He tried to turn around but felt a sharp blow to the head. A flash of pain. Darkness. When he came to, there was blood all around, motionless bodies, and it was completely unclear how much time had passed. Doug went instinctively closer, tried to understand what had happened, and exactly at this moment, Leah entered the room. Her scream drowned out everything around. From the first minutes of the investigation, one thing was clear to the police officers. The picture looked too simple, too obvious. Doug, covered in blood. Next to him, the bodies. But the absence of fight traces on his hands, strange details like smeared paint, neatly removed shoes and work tools that had been left on the porch raised questions. The patrol officers quickly examined the property and the house and concluded that there had been no break-in. Doors, windows, everything was intact, the locks undamaged. The only indication of intrusion, a barely visible paint trace left by a bicycle at the back door. But even this was barely recognizable and could quite possibly have occurred accidentally, since there were hundreds of bicycles in the settlement. However, these details were not so important for now. What was important was one thing. Doug remained the only suspect. They brought him to the station, photographed and documented every blood trace on his clothing, every scratch and scrape. After just a few hours, the investigation received the results of the first analyses, which only confused the case even more. On Doug's clothing was the girl's blood, but only splashes. On his hands and under his fingernails were no traces of struggle or defense attempts. Furthermore, the medical examination found Doug had a severe concussion, which confirmed his words about the attack from behind. But who then was this unknown attacker? While the investigators racked their brains over the questions, Doug sat in the cell and still repeated to himself, "I wanted to help." He did not know that this story would completely reverse in just a few days, and Amelia Carson's name would appear in the case in a completely unexpected way. But now, in the first hours after the terrible discovery, no one thought of the quiet babysitter girl whom everyone knew and trusted. Everyone saw only Doug, the man who stood in blood over two lifeless bodies, the man who sought to explain the inexplicable. Was he guilty? That remained a mystery for now. One thing was obvious. That evening changed the life of the settlement forever, and everyone who knew this family would not be able to walk calmly past the house on Lakeview Drive for a long time. But the truth was only beginning to come to the surface. And soon the residents of Perry Sound would learn that behind the door of the children's room were hidden not just one, but several terrible secrets. And while the police officers brought Doug to the station, the real culprit observed the events from a completely different side and counted the minutes until the moment he would be discovered. The The question of whether Douglas Reed was a murderer or a hero remained open, but soon new details would emerge that would make everyone rethink what had happened, because sometimes reality proves to be more terrible than the most terrible assumptions. When terrible things happen somewhere far away, you perceive them differently, as news, as a movie plot. But when tragedy strikes an ordinary family, one like thousands of others, everything becomes completely different. That torturous question arises. How could this have happened here at all, precisely to them? The Macready family was completely ordinary, if one can say that. The mother, Leah, a nurse at the local clinic, always busy and tired after shifts. She had long blonde hair, tired eyes, and the habit of drinking cold coffee that she had forgotten on the kitchen table since morning. Sometimes when she came home, Leah would take off her medical clogs right at the door and go quietly to the girls' bedroom to make sure everything was all right. She often said to her colleagues, "The girls are everything I get up for every morning." Emma, the older one, loved to paint and could sit for hours, bent over a sheet of paper, drawing something with colorful felt-tip pens and paint. Her room was decorated with drawings of unicorns, cats and castles, typical fantasies, typical dreams. She liked pizza with pineapple and was always a bit offended when someone said that was strange. The younger one, Grace, was completely different. A lively child, constantly in motion, with tousled chestnut hair and huge eyes that looked at the world with unconcealed interest. She loved hide-and-seek games and hid every time in the same place, in the closet behind her mother's coat, believing that surely no one would find her there. They lived in Perry Sound, a quiet Canadian settlement on the shore of a lake, surrounded by coniferous forest. This is such a place where everyone knows each other, and if not by name, then at least by sight. Their people rarely lock doors, and normally you can borrow sugar or a screwdriver from the neighbors without asking questions. It is precisely in such a place that you feel safe. It is precisely for this reason that the tragedy that befell the Macready family seemed completely impossible to everyone. In order to both work and take care of the girls, Leah hired a babysitter 3 times a week. 17-year-old Amelia Carson. Everyone knew and loved her, especially the children, because she was always cheerful and never refused another episode of the favorite cartoon series before bedtime. She came by bicycle, parked it neatly behind the back door where the girls were already waiting to immediately draw her into their games and stories. Leah said more than once to her friends that she had incredible luck finding someone like that. "I don't know what I would do without her." But that evening, the babysitter was delayed, and Leah went to the evening shift despite her concerns, warning the girls that Amelia would be there soon. She gave clear instructions, not to open the door to strangers and to keep the phone on just in case. The girls were already old enough to stay alone for short periods, and the settlement seemed so quiet that there was no particular reason to worry. The Macready family house looked completely ordinary for this area. Single story, tidy, surrounded by flower beds that Leah planted every spring. Inside there was nothing unusual either. Simple furniture, children's toys neatly sorted into baskets, and always some disorder that is characteristic of houses with children. In terms of technology, there seemed to be only the minimum. A motion detector at the back door, and that was all. There were no external cameras, and who would have installed cameras in such a quiet place? However, precisely this detail later became the key. The house was cozy, lovable, and completely defenseless against what was to happen. The back door, to which almost no one had ever paid attention, was poorly lit and led directly to a path that led into the pine forest. Precisely this path Amelia often used, parking her bicycle, and precisely it proved to be that vulnerable point through which misfortune entered the house. The tragedy seems incredible when you look at the photos of the Macready family that were taken just a few weeks before what happened. There they are at a picnic by the lake. There Emma is feeding ducks, and Grace is trying to catch a dragonfly. There they are laughing together about something of their own, so simple and childlike. These shots look ordinary, so normal that one involuntarily thinks, this could have been any family. Absolutely any. Precisely this thought, frightening and completely incomprehensible, did not leave the residents of Perry Sound for a long time after the incident became known. Indeed, how can such a thing happen in a completely normal world where there is nothing suspicious? Nothing that could have caused concern in advance. But no one yet knew the most important thing. The one who destroyed the Macready family's world was much closer than one could have suspected, and the absence of cameras, sensors, and elementary caution only made the task easier for the person who decided to intrude into their lives and leave something terrible behind. Soon, the investigation would begin to unroll this story, and at the center of attention would be those details that no one had paid attention to before. Those little things that seemed completely harmless and that would lead the police officers to completely unexpected discoveries. But while Perry Sound was just beginning to understand the scale of what had happened, the Macready family transformed from a symbol of peace into a frightening example of how fragile the most ordinary world can be. And now the investigators had to find out who and how had entered the house, bypassing the only quiet signal, the signal of the sensor at the back door that no one heard. Because sometimes precisely the quietest details prove to be the loudest when it comes to a tragedy. Sometimes minutes decide everything. In the life of the Macready family, such a time period was exactly 6 minutes. Only 6 minutes separated the last proven sign of life from the moment when someone else entered the house. This was confirmed not by witness statements, but by dry, impartial numbers of electronic devices. At 18:12, Leah leaves the house and drives to work, and her departure is recorded by the neighbor's camera, the last point at which she looks completely calm. The next significant moment, 1931, when the neighbor's doorbell unexpectedly recorded a child's scream. A short sound, piercing, shrill, not play, not laughter, but a scream that makes the heart stop. The neighbors heard this sound but quickly attributed it to ordinary children's games. No one even thought to worry. And exactly 6 minutes after this strange scream, at 1937, the motion detector at the back door of the Macready house is triggered. This door leads directly to the small backyard and the forest, and it was rarely locked for the night. Normally, the sensor silently registered the arrival of the babysitter, Amelia, who came here by bicycle. But that evening, everything went differently. Precisely these 6 minutes now became the most important link. What happened inside the house? Why did no one hear anything except that single scream? Who opened this door? Amelia, the delayed babysitter, or someone completely different whom one did not expect and did not suspect? The investigators would later return to this moment again and again, go through these minutes over and over again, trying to imagine what happened in the house. But for now, only one thing was clear. The opening of the back door became that event after which everything changed. Precisely then, the quiet, peaceful house ceased to be a safe place and transformed into a crime scene for investigation. At this moment, the investigation begins to unroll from the most important question. Was the one who entered the house at 1937 a criminal or a person who sought to prevent the misfortune? Neither the police nor the residents of Perry Sound yet knew that precisely these 6 minutes would change not only the fate of the Macready family, but also the life of the entire settlement. When such a thing happens, every normal person first thinks of burglary, robbery, a criminal from outside. But sometimes the obvious versions immediately fly into the trash can as soon as you just look at the facts. This time the police did not even think of the variant of a burglary. It simply did not exist. No one had tried to break the lock, break windows, or secretly enter through the basement. This thought is much more frightening. It means that the one who was in the Macready house during those fateful minutes was someone who was known, someone who was trusted. Forensic technicians quickly came to the crime scene. Their task, quietly, methodically, and without emotions, to examine every little thing that would help reconstruct the picture of what happened in these 6 terrible minutes. The Macready house was neatly cordoned off with yellow police tape. And now people in white suits and rubber gloves carefully examined every corner. Their conclusion was simple and clear. There were no traces of violent intrusion. The main door was locked, the windows intact and firmly bolted from the inside. The only point on which the investigation's attention concentrated was the back door. Precisely, it was open. Precisely through it, someone had entered the house at 1937. The sensor had clearly registered this moment. The criminal had not broken it down, had not damaged the lock, had not broken the glass. He had simply walked in as if coming home, as if he had been welcome here. The police officers stood by the back veranda and looked at the weak light of the lantern that illuminated the narrow path leading into the darkness of the forest. This path was familiar to the girls and Amelia, their regular babysitter. Normally, Amelia came here by bicycle, parked it by the veranda, and went into the house when the girls opened for her. That's how it had always been. But tonight, she was delayed. And although the babysitter was nowhere to be seen, logic suggested that precisely someone familiar could be at the door and easily be let in. However, the forensic technicians found no traces of struggle or disorder inside the house, in the kitchen, and in the hallway. Everything looked as if nothing special had happened. The dishes after dinner stood quietly in the sink. Children's drawings lay on the table. Things were in their places. This stood in sharp contrast to the nightmare that was discovered in the children's room. It felt as if everything terrible had happened suddenly, quickly, without a chance for protection or resistance. The investigators understood. The criminal had entered calmly, confidently, possibly even smiling. He was not in a hurry, was not nervous. He was at home here, or at least seemed so. The first to come under the close observation of the police was Doug Reed, precisely that neighbor who had been found at the crime scene. Precisely, he stood covered in blood in the girls' room and repeated the same thing over and over. I wanted to help. His words sounded unbelievable against the background of what the officers saw. While they examined the house and the grounds, Doug was already being interrogated at the police station. They tried to understand what exactly had happened in those few minutes that he could not or would not explain. The questions became more and more numerous, but clarity did not increase. How had Doug gotten inside if the door was not damaged? If he had not broken down the door, then he either had a key or the girls had opened for him. But why precisely to him, at such a moment when the babysitter had not yet come and Leah was at work? He was an acquaintance, neighbor, friend of the family, and they had trusted him before. The children could quite well have opened the door themselves when they saw a familiar face. This led the investigators back to Doug again and again. He looked dejected, confused, frightened. But that's exactly how people sometimes look who have just done something terrible and are trying to understand how they should now live with it. The police officers could not ignore the obvious. Blood, presence at the crime scene, and the complete absence of a reasonable explanation. However, the investigators also understood something else. To accuse prematurely would have been a mistake. As long as there was no weighty evidence of his guilt, these were only suspicions. And suspicions, that is not yet a verdict. They knew that they had to go further, look broader, examine everyone who could have come into this house without breaking in, everyone who could have stood so close that one would have opened the door to them smiling and trustingly. Precisely at this moment, as the suspicions drew the ring around Doug ever tighter, another figure began to become visible on the horizon, a figure that no one had taken seriously until now. But that would be later. And for now, the police stood before a simple fact. The criminal had not broken down the door. Someone had opened for him, or he had gone in himself because he had a key. And this fact pointed directly to the person who had been found inside. Douglas Reed. Now it was up to the investigators to understand whether the blood on his hands was evidence of guilt or a desperate attempt to help. This fine line would determine the course of the further investigation. When burglary was ruled out and the circle of suspects narrowed significantly, the investigation's gaze fell again on the only person who had been found exactly there, in the room, next to what could impossibly be explained otherwise than as a cruel crime: Doug Reed. It was precisely his words and his behavior that now made him figure number one in this tragedy. And here the question was no longer whether he could have done it, but why. Doug, or officially Douglas Reed, was an ordinary middle-aged man. He was 41 years old, worked in the local auto repair shop, had a solid reputation as someone you could rely on. He smiled often, was always ready to help. The neighbors knew that they could entrust him with house keys when they had to go away for the weekend. Outwardly, the typical Canadian neighbor from a small settlement. Worn jeans, work shoes, the somewhat tired face of a person accustomed to physical labor. It seemed this was exactly how a person should look who would be the first to rush to help when there were problems. But now it was precisely he who stood before the investigators, completely covered with traces of the terrible occurrence. During interrogation, Doug spoke incoherently, repeating the same thing over and over as if trying to convince himself of his own words. "I was at home. Heard a strange noise. Something like screaming. At first I thought the children were playing, but then the sound got louder. I couldn't help but check. The back door was open. I went in, called for the girls, and at that moment something hit me from behind. I remember poorly after that. I came to surrounded by blood, everything like in a fog. I tried to help, but it was already too late. His clothing was completely stained with blood. The forensic technicians confirmed that it was the girl's blood, and not just drops, but sprays, as if Doug had been nearby during that terrible moment. But the police found neither the weapon with which he had allegedly been struck, nor traces of the one who could have done it. In the room, there had been no one except him and the victims. His story looked like an awkward attempt to justify his presence there where he should not have been. The investigators could not ignore the obvious facts. Either Doug was telling the truth, and someone else had been in the house who attacked him and disappeared unnoticed, or he was precisely that criminal who, when he realized he had been caught, decided to play the role of the hero who sought to help. Despite the doubts, the investigation at the moment had a main suspect, Douglas Reed. And although his words seemed sincere, the facts spoke stubbornly against him. But this was not definitive proof of his guilt. The story, in which not everything was clear, left room, a doubt, forced the investigators to look further, to search for the one who could be that someone else, who hid in the shadows and remained unnoticed so far. It was precisely this indeterminacy, this subtle hint that there was something bigger than the version about the neighbor who simply snapped, that did not allow the investigation to stop at the simple and obvious. Soon, the police would open new pages of this case and discover details that would lead them far beyond the initial version. When the investigation's suspicions had almost already formed into an understandable picture, the laboratory unexpectedly presented them with something strange, contradictory, that fell out of the general logic. Yes, on Doug's clothing was indeed the victim's blood. Not drops, but sprays that testified to immediate presence next to the girls at the moment of the tragedy. But at the same time, something else appeared that forced one to think about whether he could have committed this crime at all. The forensic medical examination of Doug established a severe concussion. The doctor was categorical. The blow that Doug had received to the head could indeed lead to short-term unconsciousness. Moreover, a hematoma was found on the back of his head, clearly fresh and completely corresponding to his statements. It turned out that Doug's story about the attack was not a complete fabrication, it had medical confirmation. The investigators decided to check every minute of Doug's evening. It turned out that he had worked in the auto repair shop until 7:15, and this was confirmed not only by colleagues' statements, but also by video recordings from the workshop's surveillance cameras. After work, Doug drove home, which took him only a few minutes, and was precisely near the Macready house at the time when the most terrible thing happened. This did not free him from all suspicions, but made the version of the simple and cold-blooded killer extremely questionable. Now the investigation found itself at a dead end. On one hand, the blood and Doug's presence at the crime scene were the strongest evidence against him. On the other hand, the alibi, medical data, and logic of events spoke the complete opposite. Doug could quite well have been a victim of circumstances and possibly even a hero who sought to help. A vicious circle emerged. The investigators could not completely strike Doug from the list of suspects, but they could not accuse him with full certainty either. The necessity arose to dig deeper into his life, to understand his past, connections, and possible motives. It was necessary to comprehend what could be hidden behind his image of the ordinary, good-natured neighbor whom adults and children trusted, because it is precisely in such seemingly simple and understandable people that sometimes the darkest secrets are hidden. Sometimes it seems as if everything is completely clear, and it suffices simply to look at a person to understand his guilt. But the case with Doug Reed went completely differently. The police literally encountered the absence of the most important thing, the motive. And without motive, even the most obvious version begins to crumble before one's eyes. The investigation began to carefully check Doug's life, his finances, personal relationships, possible conflicts that could have led to the tragedy. And the deeper they dug, the clearer it became that he simply had no reasons to commit such a crime. No debts, no promissory notes, no financial problems. Doug lived quietly, received a stable salary, and had never been involved in anything dubious. He did not gamble, was not alcohol or drug dependent. With neighbors, the relationships were balanced and even friendly. No one could remember that he had ever raised his voice or shown aggression. As for private life, here too, nothing suspicious. Bachelor, lives alone, occasionally meets with women, but no serious relationships that could have led to any conflicts. Colleagues at the auto repair shop expressed themselves exclusively positively about him, called him a reliable and responsible employee, a person you could rely on in any situation. The investigators also turned to Doug's psychological profile. The psychologists confirmed he did not correspond at all to the image of a person capable of such a cruel crime. Doug had no history of aggressive behavior, no criminal record, not even minor violations. Calm, balanced, always ready to help. How could such a person suddenly snap and do something so monstrous? This complete contrast between the evidence pointing to his immediate presence at the moment of the tragedy and the complete absence of motive became a real dead end for the investigation. How can you accuse someone who did not have a single reason to commit a crime? But the investigators knew one thing when such a dead end arises in a case. It means you must dig deeper and search where you had not even thought to search before. They needed something completely new, a turning piece of evidence or detail that would be capable of completely changing the course of the investigation. And precisely such evidence was soon found. Sometimes all that is needed to completely overturn a case is one clear, scientifically proven fact. And in Douglas Reed's story, it was precisely the laboratory that became the place where the case completely changed direction. It seemed everything was decided. Everything pointed to Doug, until a report with irrefutable evidence fell on the investigators' table that completely shattered the familiar version. The laboratory experts found not the slightest traces of the victim's DNA on Doug's hands and under his fingernails. On his clothing was blood, yes, but under the nails and on the skin, nothing. This seemed impossible if he had been the one who carried out the attack. Every person who participates in a fight or resistance inevitably leaves traces on himself. Here was nothing of the kind. The investigators initially did not believe it, thought some error had occurred, and requested verification of the data. But the repeated analysis gave the same result: clean. Furthermore, the forensic technicians provided a detailed analysis of the arrangement of bloodstains on Doug's clothing. They explained clearly, These stains are the result of passive presence. They could only get on his clothing if he was nearby, but did not directly participate in the action itself. This was confirmation that Doug had not attacked, not fought, not tried to protect himself from any blows or attacks. He had been there, but only as an observer or victim of an attack, by no means as a murderer. The investigators, who had recently been ready to officially charge Doug, now found themselves in a difficult situation. The expert's conclusion was clear. Doug Reed had not committed this crime. He could not have been an active participant when considering all the physical evidence. The investigation reached a dead end that destroyed everything that had previously seemed obvious. If not Doug, then who? This question hung in the air and created a vacuum of uncertainty. Now the investigation had to return to the beginning, rethink everything anew. They realized that somewhere a mistake had been made, that they had overlooked an important detail, possibly quite an inconspicuous one. It was precisely now that the investigation received a new start, and the police faced the prospect of delving again into studying all those who had access to the house and could enter it freely. And although all suspicions were removed from Doug Reed, much work still lay ahead of them. The investigators knew one thing: the real criminal still remained somewhere nearby, and now they faced beginning the search anew, but with a completely different approach and new information in their hands. When it became obvious that Doug Reed could not be the person the police had sought to expose for so long, the investigators shifted their focus sharply. They stopped concentrating on personality and switched to the cold and impartial world of evidence. And it was precisely at this moment that details emerged that turned the entire case upside down and pointed to the existence of a third person whose presence had seemed completely unnoticed until this moment. At the crime scene, amid the chaos and disorder, the investigators discovered something that had previously escaped their attention: a metal bottle with deep dents on its surface. The experts were unanimous. It was precisely this bottle that had been used as the weapon with which Doug Reed had been struck on the head. The medical report confirmed clearly. The character and strength of the blow corresponded completely to the injuries found on Reed's back of the head. It turned out that he had indeed been stunned, as he had claimed from the beginning. But who could have delivered this blow? Another important find was a knife. This was precisely the weapon that had left the terrible traces on the room walls. Until this moment, the police had not been able to understand who exactly had held this knife in their hands. But this time, the forensic technicians were lucky. They discovered a partial fingerprint on the handle. It was weak, barely recognizable, but completely sufficient to draw an important conclusion. This was not Doug's fingerprint, and certainly not the fingerprint of one of the girls. This meant the knife had been held by that unknown third person they had been searching for so long. And the last piece of evidence that finally solidified thoughts about the existence of a third person was discovered at the back door of the McCready house. The experts found small particles of fresh paint there, corresponding to the type used on bicycle frames. The particles were too fresh to be accidental, too distinct to be ignored. Someone had recently, possibly literally on the same evening, leaned their bicycle against this door. And this was clearly not Doug Reed. He had come on foot from his property through the neighbor's yard and had never used a bicycle. Now the investigation had a clear picture of the new character, that ghost who had remained completely invisible until now. A person who had come by bicycle entered quietly through the back door, held a knife and used a metal bottle to stun the first witness to his crime. But who was this? To whom could this bicycle belong? How had this person been so close to the family that the girls let him in without doubt? These questions brought the investigation back to the very first starting point, but now with completely different initial data. If previously the police had been convinced of the neighbor's guilt, now they had to admit that the real criminal had skillfully remained hidden behind the image of an ordinary, familiar person. The investigation faced going the entire way again, step by step, carefully checking all those who were in the close environment of the Macready family and could have calmly appeared at the door on the evening of the tragedy. They were certain of only one thing. This was a person the girls knew and trusted. Now the investigators' task was clear: to determine who this ghost on the bicycle was, the person who had left the only fingerprint on the knife and paint traces on the door. It was precisely behind him that a new hunt now began, and the police felt that this pursuit would soon lead them to a completely unexpected turn. Sometimes the main suspect becomes a person no one would have thought of at the beginning. Until now, the Macready family's babysitter Amelia Carson had only been mentioned in passing in this case. She was remembered fleetingly, the one who was supposed to watch the girls, but was late. But after new evidence emerged, her name suddenly found itself at the center of the investigation. And this name now sounded louder and louder. Amelia Carson, a 17-year-old girl, had been working as a babysitter for the Macreadys for almost a year. She belonged to those teenagers trusted by both neighbors and Leah's colleagues. She was often seen with the girls on the playground or walking by the lake. She was calm, orderly, and very responsible. Her bicycle, brightly painted and conspicuous, was her faithful companion. And it was precisely its traces in the form of paint particles that were now discovered at the back door of the Macready house. Was this a coincidence? The police immediately began checking Amelia more thoroughly. The first step: the fingerprint from the knife. In the databases, the fingerprint yielded no result. The girl had no previously registered legal violations. But this did not calm the investigation, but rather worried it on the contrary. When they tried to contact her, it turned out that Amelia had literally disappeared. She did not answer calls, her phone was turned off, and her parents and friends did not know where she was. This was extremely strange for a girl who was always reachable and had never previously given cause for concern. And then another strange fact emerged. When Amelia's bank accounts were checked, the investigators discovered regular payments from Leah Macready. The sum was modest, only $150 per month, but it was transferred secretly, unofficially. It soon turned out that this was the money for babysitting services that Leah paid Amelia regularly, without attaching great importance to it. However, these payments no longer looked so harmless in the context of the investigation. Now it became clear that Amelia had regular access to the house, knew the family's life rhythm, and possibly even had a spare key. And her sudden disappearance became another large red mark against her name. Soon the police officially declared Amelia Carson wanted as a person of interest to the investigation. Her name was mentioned for the first time on local television and spread in the news, causing incomprehension and unrest among the residents of Perry Sound. No one could believe that this quiet and calm girl could be involved in something so terrible. Now the investigators understood. Either they were on the right track, or the story was making another sharp turn and leading them astray. But for now, Amelia Carson had become the main suspect, and it was precisely her face they were now searching for throughout the area. And her disappearance and proximity to the Macready family forced the police to rethink the entire case, already through the prism of a completely new version. Sometimes a person's past contains much more than it appears at first glance. And Amelia Carson's story was exactly like that, hiding dark sides that no one had previously seen or wanted to notice. Simple, brief facts of her biography opened doors to a world that no one from Amelia's circle of acquaintances had even suspected. A world full of the unspoken, pain, and possibly jealousy. Amelia was raised by a guardian, a strict and not very emotional person who had another ward, Amelia's younger sister, a girl with serious health problems. This sister needed constant attention, care, and love, which often left Amelia in the shadows, in second place. Possibly it was precisely then that this bitter feeling arose in Amelia's soul. Jealousy toward those who received attention, tenderness, and care of which she herself was deprived. It was known that Amelia had regular consultations with a psychologist. No one from her circle considered this strange, rather even commendable. The girl was trying to sort out her teenage problems, but when the police pulled her medical records, it turned out that the situation was much more serious than simple teenage anxieties. The doctor noted in her chart mixed antisocial depressive disorder, accompanied by regular outbursts of aggression and inexplicable anger. It was precisely this information that completely changed the investigators' view of Amelia. Now the girl's disappearance took on a completely different tone. This was no longer just a babysitter who had accidentally come under suspicion, but a person who could have serious psychological problems and a strong motive. That painful jealousy toward all other children who were loved and happy. Amelia ceased to be just a person of interest to the investigation. Now her search acquired special urgency, because the police realized behind her disappearance hid a real threat to the community. If Amelia was indeed capable of such a thing, then she had to be found as quickly as possible before she did something even more terrible. Sometimes the investigation sharply changes its direction, from theories and evidence to active actions. This is exactly what happened when the police began the physical search for Amelia Carson. The search was quiet, tense, and with each step the detectives felt they were approaching the revelation of a terrible truth that had been hidden very close by, literally under the noses of the residents of Perry Sound. On the 29th of May 2018, the police received the first real clue. 4 kilometers from the McCready house, on a path that led deep into the forest, a backpack was found. The backpack had been carelessly thrown into the bushes as if someone wanted to get rid of it as quickly as possible. When the investigators carefully opened it, they were immediately hit by the sharp smell of bleach mixed with something else, more unpleasant. Inside was a pair of pajamas, simple for teenagers, with a light pattern but covered with stains that even bleach had not been able to completely hide. The experts had no doubt. On the pajamas were exactly those traces that someone had sought to hide. And now these stains became silent witnesses that confirmed the most terrible suspicions of the investigation. Now the police knew exactly. Amelia had been here recently and was moving quickly, trying to destroy all traces of her presence. From the place where the backpack was found, the police officers began methodically combing through the forest. Every meter was carefully checked. Every suspicious movement in the bushes made the detectives stop and freeze tensely. One of the local residents remembered an old, almost forgotten treehouse that children had built many years ago. Now this place was almost completely hidden among the dense tree crowns, and one could only get there via a barely visible path. The police officers immediately went there, feeling that they were on the border of something important. They moved carefully, trying not to make noise, step by step approaching the place where Amelia might be hiding. The little house appeared unexpectedly. One noticed it literally at the last moment. High up in the tree, almost invisible among branches and leaves, it seemed empty and abandoned. But the silence that reigned all around was too suspicious. The detectives climbed up carefully, completely prepared for resistance. But it did not follow. On the 30th of May 2018, Amelia Carson was arrested. She sat quietly, as if she were expecting the police officers. No tears, no screams, no resistance. Only a tired look that said more than all words. It seemed Amelia had already decided everything for herself, and was now just waiting for someone to come get her. Her arrest became the culmination of the long search and enormous work of the investigation. Now the police were certain that exactly she was the key to solving this whole terrible story. But before them stood the last, most important step, to find out what exactly had happened on that terrible evening in the McCready house and why the girl who had been trusted became the cause of the tragedy that shook the small settlement. Now began the countdown to the moment when the truth would come to light. Sometimes investigations do not end with long conversations and confessions, but with silent evidence that speaks louder than all words. When the police arrested Amelia Carson, she said not a word. Her eyes were empty, cold, and the police officers understood that they might not wait for a confession at all. But soon it became clear that this was not so important. She had things with her that spoke for themselves. The first thing the investigators noticed, a skateboard, neatly leaned against the tree trunk under the little house. The skateboard was full of stains that spoke for themselves. The experts quickly confirmed. On it were blood traces that matched the blood that had been found in the McCready house. This evidence was almost a verdict, but that was only the beginning. Next to the skateboard lay a notebook, simple for teenagers with stickers on the cover, but inside it proved to be not so harmless at all. The investigators leafed through the pages and froze. Between chaotic notes and drawings were lines that made them feel a shiver down their backs. Double laughter. This short, almost innocent phrase now took on a completely creepy meaning. But the final point was set by checking the fingerprint from the knife handle. Until this moment, this had been only a faceless trace of an unknown person. But now, after comparison with Amelia's fingerprints, no doubts remained. Complete match. The fingerprint belonged to her, and now her guilt became not a theory, but a cold and irrefutable fact. The question, who, no longer stood before the investigation. Direct evidence proved definitively. Exactly Amelia Carson had held the murder weapon in her hands. Exactly she had left her traces both on the skateboard and on the knife. Exactly she had thrown away the bloody pajamas and tried to destroy the traces with bleach. The question of her involvement was closed once and for all. But the investigators understood perfectly that behind the answer to one question immediately appeared another, much more tormenting and complex. The question, why? Why had the girl whom everyone considered quiet, responsible, and reliable done such a thing? What could have driven her to this terrible crime? Now the police faced the most difficult thing, to understand her motives, to look deeper into her world, which turned out to be not so simple as it had seemed before. The next stage of the investigation promised to be the darkest and most disturbing, but exactly it was supposed to finally unveil the secret of Amelia Carson and put the final point in this grim story. Usually in such stories, everyone waits for a confession, clear words that would explain what happened. But Amelia said nothing. Instead of her, the pages of her notebook spoke, covered with short phrases, drawings, and strange notes. Exactly in them, the investigators finally found the key to understanding the whole thing, an explanation that turned out to be more terrible than one could have assumed. On one of the pages, Amelia wrote only 2 words: double laughter. These 2 simple words became the door into her inner world, where ordinary children's voices transformed into something completely different, into a painful trigger that provoked in her attacks of uncontrollable rage and aggression. Psychiatric experts who examined the notebook and Amelia herself confirmed these words were not just a random note, but a clearly formulated ideation, an obsessive thought that pursued her day after day. From the psychiatrist's reports, it became clear that Amelia felt deep, pathological jealousy toward the girls she was supposed to watch. Every time she heard their laughter, saw their joy, deep resentment, anger, and hatred awakened in her. In her consciousness, all happy voices transformed into a painful reminder that she herself had never been the center of attention, that she had always been left aside with someone else being preferred. The psychiatrists called this pathological ideation of extinguishing laughing voices, and that sounded terrible even for the specialists. In Amelia's notebook were also other disturbing notes. Why are they happy and I am not? They don't deserve it. And the most frightening, extinguish voices. Exactly these notes, made by the hand of a teenager whom everyone considered completely normal, now seemed completely creepy. It became clear that the motive of her act was not personal hatred of concrete people at all, but a deeply rooted mental disorder that had turned her consciousness into a battlefield where ordinary children's joys were perceived as an unbearable threat. Amelia herself did not understand to the end what exactly was happening with her, and this made the situation even more tragic and unpredictable. Her actions could not be explained by ordinary logic. They were dictated exclusively by the painfully distorted reality that she had created within herself. Now, when the investigators learned the true nature of her motives, the picture of what had happened finally gained frightening clarity. Now it was clear why the crime had become so cruel and irrational. Amelia's mental disorder completely directed her actions, forced her to see in completely innocent people enemies who deserved punishment. Exactly this motive was now officially recorded by the investigation. Amelia Carson committed the crime not out of any personal hatred, but because of an illness that completely distorted her perception of reality. Exactly this conclusion forced the investigation to move further to the final point of the examination. Now remained the last, decisive step, the official conclusion of the psychiatrists and the court, which was to decide how to proceed further with Amelia, and what one can do at all with a person who has committed a crime without understanding to the end what he is doing. Every puzzle must sooner or later receive its explanation. Now the police could finally reconstruct the events of that terrible evening minute by minute, second by second, connecting all the facts that had previously seemed random or inexplicable. The absence of a break-in, Doug Reed's concussion, even that children's hide-and-seek game. Now everything took its place in the clear and merciless picture of what had happened. So the 23rd of May, 2018. At 1812, Leah McCready left the house, went to work, and left the girls Emma and Grace alone. Amelia Carson was supposed to come later, but that evening the babysitter did not ring the doorbell. She came in through the back door, which the girls, knowing her, calmly opened from inside. Amelia was for them a familiar, safe person. In their consciousness, nothing hinted at misfortune. Amelia stayed quietly in the house, trying to behave normally while the girls played. She waited for the moment when they would begin their favorite game, hide and seek. As soon as the girls ran off to hide, Amelia began to act. Why exactly this game? Because it reminded her of her own childhood, of that painful past when she herself was constantly left in the shadows, forgotten, not sought. When Emma and Grace began to laugh and call to each other, Amelia could no longer control herself. The sound of their happy voices became the trigger that finally broke her psyche. At 1931, the neighbor's doorbell recorded a sharp scream, a scream that was first taken for ordinary children's games. But that was not just a child's scream. That was the moment when Amelia attacked. Chaos and disorder, knife marks on the walls and smeared paint. All of this were witnesses of an instantaneous outbreak of rage and aggression. Amelia was already beside herself, had completely lost connection to reality. At 1937, the back door opened again. That was Doug Reed, who had heard strange noises and decided to check if everything was all right. He entered the house and immediately went to the children's room from which sounds of struggle were coming. At this moment, Amelia, who heard his steps, hid behind the room door, and when Doug entered, she struck him sharply on the head with a metal bottle. The blow was strong, he lost consciousness and fell to the ground. Amelia understood that she had little time. She quickly threw off the bloody clothes, changed, and rushed through the same back door into the forest, grabbing her skateboard. Paint traces from her bicycle, which she had often used before, remained on the door, and now these traces became important evidence. Hastily fleeing, she tried to get rid of the things, threw the backpack with the bleach-treated pajamas into the bushes and hid in the old children's treehouse. This sequence completely explained all the previously strange-seeming facts. Why there were no signs of break-in. The girls opened the door themselves because they trusted their babysitter. Why Doug Reed had a concussion and blood on his clothes, but no fight marks on his hands. He did not even manage to understand who struck him. Why precisely the hide-and-seek game became the fateful moment? Because it triggered the mechanism of painful jealousy and anger that Amelia could not cope with. Now all details and facts came together into a unified logical chain of events, and the investigation finally closed the circle. All puzzles received their explanation, and the police could confidently say that the picture of the crime was completely reconstructed. But although the sequence of events no longer raised questions, the last step remained. The court, which had to decide how to deal with Amelia Carson, the girl whose psyche had turned an ordinary children's game into a terrible tragedy. Precisely there, in court, this story was to be ended, which had become a grim lesson for all of Perry Sound. After everything heard and seen, people expected a harsh verdict. It seemed there could be no other option. Too terrible was this crime. Too painful did this tragedy become for the small settlement. But on the 14th of February 2019, the Ontario court delivered a verdict that became a shock for many. Amelia Carson was declared not criminally responsible due to severe mental illness. This decision looked like a paradox, especially after the detailed descriptions of her deed and the irrefutable evidence of her guilt. However, the court could not ignore the expert opinion, which clearly stated, Amelia did not recognize the consequences of her actions because of the mixed antisocial depressive disorder. In her consciousness, the world was so distorted that she did not perceive what was happening as reality. Precisely therefore, the court could not send her to an ordinary prison. Amelia was committed to the Waypoint Center for Youth Forensics, a special facility where professional psychiatric help is provided to youth with similar diagnoses. This verdict meant indefinite stay in the hospital, not imprisonment, which provoked an ambivalent reaction among the residents of Perry Sound. Precisely this court decision placed the legal period in Amelia Carson's case. But although the court determined her fate, the residents of the settlement could not reconcile themselves for a long time with the fact that legal justice and human justice are not always the same thing. Now a new question stood before them. How should one continue living, knowing that Amelia Carson had not received punishment in the ordinary sense of this word, but remained, albeit under medical supervision, but still outside an ordinary prison? Sometimes, even after a story seems to be finished, a detail remains that can disturb inner peace. Such a detail in Amelia Carson's case became a strange note in her notebook. Between drawings and frightening notes, the police found something they could not decipher to the end. She wrote, +2, May, +1, September. Precisely this question mark after September left a disturbing feeling of incompleteness. Time passed, and the residents of Perry Sound tried to return to normal life. Leah McCready, who could not overcome what had happened, soon moved away and sought to start everything anew where nobody knew her story. Doug Reed remained in the settlement, although he was still looked at cautiously for a long time, not knowing how one should behave toward a person who had become an involuntary participant in a terrible tragedy. It seemed the town was gradually healing its wounds, but Amelia's strange note continued to live like a ghost in the memory of the investigators. Could there have been other episodes? Whom could she have meant? These questions simply hung in the air. The investigation yielded no results. Neither in May nor in September had other similar cases been registered. Possibly that was only the fantasy of a girl with disturbed psyche. But perhaps there was something the police did not see. Video surveillance in the area was installed only 4 years later, 2022, and it could no longer help clarify this question. The story was officially closed, but precisely this one, strange note, left a heavy, disturbing aftertaste. The aftertaste of a story that seemingly was finished, but in reality will never be completely forgotten.